Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fourth session of our morning program for the ITF Transport Outlook launch. This session will focus on the future of freight transport. And for those of you who have just joined us, welcome. My name is Malathi Fernando. I am a co-author and the project manager for this edition of the Outlook. It's great to be here moderating this session. You will hear shortly from my colleague, Francisco Furtado, who will present the findings on the future of global freight transport. And we are delighted to later be joined by Susana Val, the director of Zaragoza Logistics Center. This will be part of an interactive discussion that you can participate in via the poll that is just being launched on the right-hand side. So please use the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen so you can submit your questions there, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. The poll question, as I mentioned, is just on that side as well. There's also a discussion box. You're welcome to chat with other participants and respond to what you're hearing in this box. It will not be moderated by ITF staff during the session, so please make sure your questions are in the Q&A box. Finally, if you're experiencing technical difficulties, please use the live support button on the top right-hand corner for assistance. That is it for housekeeping. Francisco, the floor is yours for your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Malathi. And good morning or good evening to all participants from around the world that join us now. I will jump right into some key numbers that come out of this chapter of the Outlook. And I would ask all of the viewers did you know that freight currently accounts for more than 40% of transport emissions. So around 40% of all of transport emissions are made by the movement of goods. Actually, in 2020, this last year, half of all transport emissions were made by freight transport. Of course, this happened because of the specific circumstances of the pandemic. As we know, personal mobility was highly restricted, while goods and supplies had to keep moving. So while there was a very intense fall in passenger activity, there was also a fall in freight activity, but to a much less degree. Although when you look at the long term, the share of freight emissions is going to be around the same as it is today, around the 40%. It might slightly increase. Now, despite of all of this, the freight sector historically has received much less policy attention than the passenger sector. And this can even be seen in some simple but important things like data collection from public authorities or the monitoring of the sector. Now, a bit as a result of the pandemic and the ensuing crisis, the fact is that there was an increased public awareness on the relevance of freight transport, of logistics. This came a bit to the forefront of people's minds during this period. And this increased public awareness is something that can be leveraged to also increase the policy attention and the policy focus on the decarbonization of the sector and even other policy areas. Another important number to bear in mind is that the overall majority of emissions from the freight sector actually come from road transport. And road, including the non-urban part of transport, but also including the urban logistics and the last mile. So, and as you can see here in the graph, this is actually going to slightly increase a long time as we move forward. So we have here a sector that, when we measure in ton kilometers, accounts for around 17% of activity, but it is responsible for around 2/3 of emissions. Now, this highlights the importance of increasing the attractiveness of multimodal solutions that employ modes that are less carbon intensive than road. But the fact is there are limits to what can be done through multimodality, and road transport has specific characteristics, namely its flexibility, accessibility throughout the entire territory, that will always make it a key component of freight transport. And so, I mean, road transport and the decarbonization of road transport itself, it is a critical aspect if we indeed want to achieve a clean transition in freight transport. A last number to highlight, it's the fact that if we simply return to normal, if we keep the current ambitions and the current trajectory, we are not going to reach the climate goals. We are not going to reach the targets. Actually, there's going to be an increase in emissions by 2015. Now, it is possible with ambitious policies to decrease emissions compared to 2015 by 64%. And if on top of these ambitious policies, we also leverage some of the trends coming out of the crisis, we can actually achieve a 72% cut in emissions by 2015. And what is behind this cut, these differences? Well, the first thing, it's a very sharp increase in efficiency and a move across all transport modes, a move towards clean energy sources. This is the first factor explaining these results. A second factor to mention is the decrease in demand for fossil fuels. Fossil fuels nowadays represent 30% of international transport activity. And most freight transport activity measured in TKMs is international. And 30% of that is fossil fuels. If we move towards a decarbonized future, there will be less fossil fuels. The demand growth will slow down in general for freight. A last aspect is that an increased focus on resilience, on the diversification of supply chains, trade regionalization will also contribute a bit to this slowdown in demand growth. And these three factors will explain then how we can achieve this substantial cut in emissions. So what are the main takeaways, some policy insights to bear in mind and that are mentioned in the freight chapter of the outlook? Well, the first thing is that we have to scale up measures that are already available and actually already deployed. There are measures, namely that increase the efficiency in freight transport, that are already applied in some parts of the world, but they are not present in other regions of the world. There's also some types of measures that are done by large companies. For instance, eco-driving is rather common in Europe for large companies, but are not applied to small companies. And for instance, when you think about road freight, the majority of the market is dominated by these small companies. So the first thing is to apply across the board in all regions of the world and for all agents that are involved in freight transport and logistics, measures that already exist that increase the efficiency of freight transport. And a specific case of this happens in urban transport, in urban logistics. And in urban logistics, we already have available low and zero tailpipe emission solutions for light commercial vehicles. These solutions already exist. They're already commercially attractive. So they should be deployed and mainstreamed to the utmost. And another thing also to take advantage of is the voluntary programs that associate the carriers, the private companies that dominate freight transport. And these voluntary programs are privileged platforms to disseminate best practices and also for the company to incentivize and motivate the companies themselves to implement these best practices. And in addition to this, we have to boost cooperation. There has to be increased cooperation between the private companies themselves in freight transport, in logistics, in order to increase the use of currently available capacity and decrease empty running. trucks and other vehicles running empty and empty return trips. And cooperation is one of the ways to achieve that. And by using the available capacity to the most, and by reducing the empty return trips, what we are doing is that we are decreasing the use of fuel, reducing fuel consumption, we are decreasing costs, we are increasing efficiency, and we are reducing emissions. Now, another critical aspect, this has been already discussed in the previous sections actually, has to do with the alignment of price incentives with the freight and with transport decarbonization ambitions. So, I mean, few carriers will adopt lower zero emission vehicles or fuels if they cost more than the conventional fuels. But generally, nowadays, the negative externalities that are produced by the use of fossil fuels are not included in the price of these fuels. Quite the opposite. Actually, there are tax exemptions for fossil fuels, namely for maritime shipping, for aviation, but not only. So a first thing to do is to phase out these tax exemptions for fossil fuels and to start including in the prices of fossil fuels the costs of these negative externalities. But, and this is extremely important, not very addressed in the previous sessions, but extremely important, we have to ensure there is a fair share of costs and benefits that come out of this transition. And people have to perceive this. If we are increasing the costs and increasing taxes, people have to perceive this as being fair. And this has to be perceived, like I said, people between different sectors of economic activity, between different social sectors, and also between different regions of the world. For instance, this carbon pricing can be introduced not as a per se measure, as a single isolated measure, but can be introduced inside a wider tax reform package, where the increase in costs in some taxes will be offset by decreases in others. And when we look at different regions across the world, we have to bear in mind that nowadays, the OECD countries, the surface emissions per capita of OECD countries are 4 times higher than in non-OECD countries. And also that the effects of carbon pricing in freight transport and also slow steaming, for instance, can fall disproportionately in the regions that are furthest from the main production and consumption centers. So this issue of equity and the fair share of costs and benefits has definitely to be taken into account. Another critical, and this is the last slide and very relevant to bear in mind, is that nowadays, when we look at non-urban freight transport, long distance, heavier loads, only rail actually as a mature, consolidated, and relatively widespread solution that ensures zero emissions transport, tailpipe always. And particularly if you look at the heavy, long-haul, heavy-duty trucking, there is no short-term perspective. I mean, in the short term, there's no short-term perspective of having a widespread zero carbon solution. And the same can be said, for instance, for aviation. But indeed, if we want to reach the climate targets, it's absolutely decisive that we do make a transition to lower zero carbon energy sources across all transport modes. And to do that, I already mentioned aligning the price incentives. Another important factor is also standardization and having standards for the these new technologies, which is very important both on the vehicle side and in the infrastructure side. And this is very important to scale up these new technologies and also to make them more attractive for the end users and more easy to use. So this is also another critical element. And I'll finish by also mentioning here of course, I mean, this has to be mentioned, the stimulus packages. And the stimulus packages used to foster the economic recovery post-pandemic, or when we enter in this new normal. And these stimulus packages play here an absolutely critical role. We live in a time of crisis. We are living in a time of crisis, but this is also a time of great opportunity. And the decisions we take today will shape the future to come for decades. And these stimulus packages, they can include investments into research for these new technologies, into the production and in distribution infrastructure for the alternative fuels, for these low and zero carbon fuels. They can also include investments into increased attractiveness of multimodal solutions, and particularly for emerging economies, this is a critical element, particularly for emerging economies, which is the renewal of the vehicle fleets, namely the road freight, but not only on road, but the renewal of the vehicle fleets, which is here a critical aspect to achieve this transition to a clean transport. Well, thank you very much for your time. Back to you, Meliti.
Thank you, Francisco, for highlighting the importance of freight policy in when we think about transport decarbonization. I now have the pleasure of introducing Susana Val, Director of the Zaragoza Logistics Center. She will be joining us to kick off our interactive discussion, talking about the need for action and also bringing some practical examples of what's already being done in the sector. Susana, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for sharing this launch time with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maliti, for your introduction. It's for me a pleasure being here today in this ITF 2021 panel. Thank you, Francisco, for your wonderful presentation about the ITF Transport Outlook 2021 as well. So I can't agree more with your words. I think we need an action plan on freight transport, and we need to consider this plan in the short, medium, and long term for sure. We can't forget that limiting the global warming by 1.5 Celsius require transport to be almost zero emissions or zero emissions by 2050. So that means that this transition to zero emissions, as you said, this cut in 72% on emissions in the next 20 or 30 years, that implies a radical revision of the whole transport system. We need to reverse the emissions trend in the last decades. Let me add that the objectives that are imposed by Kyoto Protocol are really difficult to meet. And to do this, data and information that must be provided that is provided in your document becomes extremely important and relevant at the time of implementing those effective plans. We know that freight transport mainly has a direct correlation with the demand. As you mentioned as well, the demand is expected to grow between the current 2021 and 2050, given the current trend. Doesn't matter the scenario, we know for sure that it's going to increase, whatever happens. So the scenario is very uncertain. We have an economic crisis. We also are immersed in the pandemic situation, and we have some rising tensions on trade. So forecasting is in freight transport is very uncertain, very hard to predict. And we also have been involved in very opposite scenarios in which technology and globalization are for sure extended. So that could be the worst scenario in which the demand of freight will increase substantially. But we also have very opposite scenarios where there is a back to the proximity world. So as you said, as you mentioned, we are facing very diverse supply chains. So that would be the best scenario in which globalization will be refused somehow. So I would like to remark the fact that decarbonization requires specific and very quick actions that need to be scaled up. So there are many short-term solutions already in practice. So for instance, we have many activities put in practice in road. You said increase load factors, improving vehicle routing, eco-driving platooning, transferring freight to lower emissions transport mode or electric transport modes. There are some examples that are willing to mitigate externalities and of the emissions produced by transport. It's worthwhile to mention the role of urban areas. These are one of the biggest concerns related to decarbonization. So in 2050, it's expected that more than 80% of the population will live in urban areas. Some measures are already put in practice, but most of them at European level or in developed countries. But for those emerging countries or regions, that are an illusion right now. So some solutions already in practice are zero emission zones, autonomous vehicles, drones are being tested in some European cities as well. And of course, there are a lot of projects currently ongoing in the field of circular economy for the decarbonization of the sector, improving resource efficiency as well. I would like to emphasize as well that policies can help to reduce emissions, but we can't rely only on policies for the entire process of decarbonization. So if we want to achieve these net zero emissions by 2050, all transport vehicles from from cars to airplanes, etc., they need to run to zero emissions energy in the future, in the short future. So in general terms, the full decarbonization requires a shift to new technologies and energy carriers as well. We need renewable, decarbonized electricity is fundamental for sure. And I must have to say that hydrogen or fuel cell trucks could offer also an alternative or complementary pathway to zero emissions. So of course, definitely the decarbonizing the entire transport require different pathways according to each transport mode. And of course, they have very different implications to the overall energy system. So for instance, in shipping, countries are currently attempting to regulate maritime emissions through the International Maritime Organization, which is really far from decarbonization right now. So the same is happening with the air transport mode as well. So some generic and drastic solutions must be implemented in the next years or in the next decades to fulfill the decarbonization target in transport by 2050. So pricing greenhouse gases, international cooperation, adopting new technologies and promotion of renewable fuels should be a priority as well. I've been involved in many or several European projects, as this is my field of expertise. I've been involved in several examples of initiatives that are currently in use. So for instance, I had the pleasure to participate in a European project called LEARN, in which we participated in the definition of the GLEC, the Global Logistics Emission Council Framework, which is a methodology based on protocols and international standards that contribute to fill the gap of the existing life cycle product for logistics, warehousing, and transportation. And within this framework, we aim to create a worldwide network of companies willing to adopt this methodology in the process of emissions, accounting, and decarbonization, of course. So I would like to emphasize that this concept of decarbonization is new or even unknown for several companies that are used to externalize their transport to third parties or to other logistics operators. So there is a long path also on education and training to achieve this mental shift by the company, in the company side, I mean. I've been also involved in some other examples of European projects focused on sustainable policies response to urban mobility transition. This is a project that we are right now facing. It's called Sprout. Or the electrification in large urban areas in developing and emerging economies is Solutions Plus, that would be transferring somehow solutions or successful solutions at European cities to other emerging countries. We are also researching how to decrease emissions with digital twins, which is a simulation tool that has been tested for the first time in urban areas in the project called LEAD. Or we are researching solutions towards decarbonization in logistics, climate neutrality, and digital transformation of supply chains, which is called, the project is called Boost Block, and has started recently at European level. So to conclude, I would like to state that there is a long path to fulfill the process of decarbonization. There is an uncertain trend given the economic and international trade unstable, and the solutions require the collaboration among all the stakeholders in the supply chain. But last but not least, there are several challenges, of course, affecting the deployment. So there is a lack of policy action, or there is not almost policy action, and the technological progress, although it's high, but it's not so high. It's following a slow pace to fulfill the 2050 target. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna. You've given us a lot to think about with all the examples of what's already being done and the fact that we are still not there. Thank you very much. So now I would like to hear from the audience via our poll. I'm going to end the poll right now and give a chance for Susanna and Francisco to comment on what our audience members have to say about decarbonizing the freight transport sector. Well, as with before, we don't have a very, runaway winner, but the two top choices are to, with 25% of the votes, support technological development in clean energy sources, both vehicles and infrastructure. And with 23% of the votes, aligning price incentives with freight decarbonization ambitions, such as phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, carbon taxes, distance charges, etc. We don't have a clear, least popular option. The rest kind of are in the 12 to 14% vote region. So Susanna, perhaps I'll give the floor to you for a quick minute to comment on some of these findings.
Okay, for me it's very interesting that there is 25% related to support technological development. It's very interesting for me. Let me add that the energy production and consumption accounts for 75% of the greenhouse gases emissions. So I think that that solution supporting technological development for the development of clean energy sources that could lead to new investments, jobs growth, of course, and contributing to the economic recovery. So I think that we can lead with this with the use of cleaner electricity produced by renewable sources, promotion of low carbon fuels, hydrogen, as I mentioned in my speech. And I think that it would be good for sectors that are really hard to decarbonize, such as heavy transport and some other industries, for instance. Aligning incentives is also interesting. I think it's inclusive and supports the economic development, and pricing could be applied to all greenhouse gases, although in practice it's only applied to carbon emissions. So I think both of them are the most interesting, because some other solutions are considered, from my point of view, are considered mostly short-term solutions. For instance, low-hanging fruits, of course, are solutions that may mitigate the externalities of freight transport, but there are no solutions for the medium or long term. So I think I would agree with the audience answer.
Thank you, Susanna. Francisco, do you have a brief addition to that?
Yes, thank you, Melissa, and thank you very much, Susanna. I just highlight that indeed, like was mentioned in the presentation, the transition to low to zero emissions fuels and vehicles with the required infrastructure is a critical part of achieving the overall decarbonization of freight transport. So I think it's no surprise that's number one. A bit more surprising, especially in contrast to the previous sessions. I don't know if the people that are viewing this session had the opportunity to view the previous ones, where carbon pricing was always like the least preferred option, while here is actually in the forefront. And I don't know if it's the way it was framed, which was a bit different, or if it's also the fact that it's not the citizens personally that are paying for this, it will be the companies paying for this. So this is kind of makes it easier, or it can be also the audience composed more by experts that are very keen in this type of measures.
Thank you, Francisco. Interesting indeed. We are now going to move away from the discussion and to the Q&A portion. So I would like to thank you again, Susana, for sharing your insights with us, and we'll welcome Luis Martinez to the stage for our Q&A portion. All right, we already have quite a few questions. So let me get started with a question for Francisco. There's a question here about, can we talk about the transportation of hydrogen? The question asks that mentions that we're currently transporting hydrogen with fossil fuel powered means, and they're asking whether we can finally use clean hydrogen to transport hydrogen. What do you see as the role of hydrogen in freight transport?
Okay, I'll be honest about this. I have some, I think hydrogen will play a part because especially for instance, for long distance road freight, it's even technologically challenging to find the zero emission solutions. It's complicated to have batteries that allow for this type of transport. At least with current technology. There's some solutions like the direct supply of energy through electric road systems that can be used, but this also has some costs, infrastructure costs. So hydrogen is seen as a possible solution in this, for instance, for this sector. I would just put here a note of caution on hydrogen being a solution for everything, because actually the production of hydrogen is a very inefficient process. Producing hydrogen from clean energy is actually a process where you lose a lot of energy. It's around 20%, I believe, that you keep. So it is part of the solution, but I don't think it will be the only solution. And actually, one important thing to bear in mind, or two important things to bear in mind, is that in different regions of the world, different pathways and even energy vectors can be more appropriate for this energy transition. And also, while nowadays we have like one single energy source, fossil fuels, diesel or gasoline, basically, in the future, we'll have a mix of solutions for different regions, for different type of operations, for different distances, for different loads. There will be more of a mix of solutions than one single solution.
Thank you, Francisco. Perhaps a question for Louise on internalizing the costs of global freight transport, and internalizing the external costs. Can you comment on how we account for that within our models, perhaps?
Yes, thank you, Melody, for the question, and we have two ways of internalizing the costs. I don't go in too much detail now, but we have one thing is the production of how much freight is moved from A to B, that already it's impacted by the cost of transport. If you change the costs by internalizing part of the externalities, you may vary this cost, and then you may even transport less freight. But also the internalization of the costs has impact on the mode split, on how the connection between A and B is produced in the shares that are done by sea, by rail, by road, or by air. Depends and waterways. It depends, of course, in the availability of solutions between the pairs of around the world. But I would say that is through these two elements, on the conversion of trade into freight volumes and in the mode split.
And perhaps, Louise, I'll stay with you for one more question. In the previous sessions, we've talked a lot about accessibility and the need to think on kind of a local development level to reduce transport demand. Can you speak a bit more on how we include that in the freight transport sector, and how it might apply specifically for goods as opposed to people?
Yes, we introduced in one of our scenarios mainly the ability of logistic chains to be more regionalized, and that the long distances would reduce with time. We see that the forecast that we had for trade by default with globalization, the average distances of trade are increasing over time and has been increasing in the last decades. And what we test in this scenario, it was reshape the patterns between the costs of the different regions and within the region, to try to see what would be the ability of having supply chains more reliant on regions, on their own region. And what happened with this is that we have the average distances decreasing significantly. This would be as an additional cost, but is an internalized cost, but not an explicit cost of having this across regions within the model.
Thank you, Louise. We have a question, Francisco, that perhaps you could answer on how, well, with the industry being so fragmented, the freight industry, and the profit margins being small, how do you introduce incentives for businesses to collaborate and increase the efficiency of last mile delivery and reduce empty running?
Well, this is actually something that, because there's other measures that have initial costs that are financial costs that are high. And for instance, I talked about fleet renewal, and in this case, the stimulus packages and direct public incentives, because the public side, although this is a privately dominated sector, for this transition, the public sector will also have a critical role. On this issue of boosting cooperation, it's different because it's not so much a cost issue. Actually, this would decrease costs. It's more a question of attitude. And it's also a question, and we mentioned this in some of our reports, I don't know if they're being shared in the discussion forum, but it's also a question, there's actually some legal barriers, to cooperation between private companies, antitrust laws, and they exist for a reason, of course, to prevent monopolies. But there are solutions like trusted third-party platforms that are being tested already by the industry, and that actually had a bit of uptake during the crisis, for instance, to reduce empty running. And that can be a solution and a promising way to achieve that, to achieve this cooperation. And other than indirect measures too, for instance, if you apply distance charges, this might also foster the sector to be a bit more rational and to decrease the vehicle kilometers and to foster consolidation of loads.
Thank you, Francisco. We have 1 minute left, so I'll ask for a quick input from Louise, perhaps, on what about the carbon generated in the production of vehicles and of energy? And it seems that perhaps the solutions that we are speaking about is a displacement of the source of carbon emissions and not necessarily a cut in total emissions. Francisco, Louise,
yes,
would you like to?
Yes, part of the solution on the as Francisco also mentioned, it also will depend on the grid quality that we have on the electricity production. Because if we are transporting our transport emissions to the other sectors, then we are not solving the problem. We are just transferring the problem. But if we get our responsibility, which is within the transport, and knowing that also the electric will also do it, so I think that this is something that we need to do in the short term also to increase and have affordable solutions that will allow decarbonization.
Thank you, Louise. Francisco, I saw you nodding there. So would you like to add something to the end?
Yeah, just one note, because I think this is a very interesting question. And this is actually a novelty of this edition of the Outlook, because before we didn't consider this. We always considered only the tailpipe direct transport emissions. But in this Outlook, it's not the focus, but we do include an assessment of the well-to-wheel emissions. And if you see in the freight chapter, there's a graph, and this is a teaser to read the chapter, because the chapter has and the entire Outlook has a wealth of information we cannot summarize in a short session like this. But if you go there, you will see there is a graph and there's a discussion exactly on how this will evolve. And indeed, there is a bit a movement of emissions further upstream. So the decrease in well-to-wheel is not so big as the tank-to-wheel, but it's still significant. You know, like just to give you an idea, it's 72% in the Reshape Plus, the tank-to-wheel, and the well-to-wheel is like 62%. So there is indeed a bit of moving upstream, but in general, there is still a huge decrease, even if you consider the well-to-wheel.
Thank you, Francisco. And that is all the time we have for today. As Francisco mentioned, there's lots more in our publication than what we've been able to cover in these quick sessions. We hope that you've enjoyed staying with us, whether you joined us from the very beginning or just for this freight in-depth look. I would like to thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Francisco, Louise, and a very special thank you to Susanna Val for sharing her insights during this session. For more information on the Outlook, you can download the executive summary for free on the ITF Summit platform. It's available in 9 different languages. Also, our website Outlook page has links to our results, links to the publication itself, and there will be recordings of these sessions when they are available. The final session this is the final session for the morning program, and we will be repeating all these sessions in the afternoon with a brand new panel of guests for time zones further west. Please join us if you missed some of the previous sessions. And before that, we do have a high-level panel that starts in half an hour. It's titled Advice to Action, Transitioning to Sustainable, Equitable Mobility. We hope to see you there. Thank you very much.